Hello students. Today we are going to discuss the second chapter of Negotiable Instruments Act, which is the types of negotiable instruments. In the last chapter, we discussed some classification of negotiable instruments, out of which one was the classification according to statute. So as per the Negotiable Instruments Act, we have been given three categories of negotiable instruments: the bills of exchange, the promissory notes, and the checks. And in today's lecture, we will understand about the bills of exchange and promissory notes only. And before I proceed with the provisions of these two kind of instruments, let me show you certain specimens of these instruments and what kind of parties and other technical aspects are involved by showing you certain images and some specimens of these instruments. So first of all, let us have a look into a bill of exchange. In any kind of a bills of exchange, there will always be three parties: the drawer, the drawee, and the payee. Now there's a transaction, there's a business transaction wherein a person has sold goods on credit to some other person. So one is supplier of the goods, the other one is the customer of the goods. Supplier has to recover money from the customer and customer seeks credit. Now customer says, I'll be making payment 1 month after. In that case, this supplier, to recover the money 1 month later, can draw a bill of exchange on that person, on the customer, wherein he will be writing in that bill of exchange that I am ordering you that you have to pay this much money after this much time to me. So in that case, this instrument will be made. So that means in any kind of bill of exchange, there have to be three parties, in which the first party is the one who draws that, who writes that instrument, who writes that bill of exchange. And this drawer is always the supplier or the person who has to recover money from you, means the creditor. Then he will be making an order on the customer, who is the debtor of this supplier, that I have to recover this money from you. So the person on whom that bill is drawn is called the drawee. Now the drawer can order the drawee to make payment to drawer himself also on due date, or he can also order to drawee that please make this payment to person C. Now there's a person C who has to recover some money from drawer. So drawer, instead of making payment himself to that C person, he may ask the drawee to pay his money, his due money, to this third party C. So in that case, this C becomes the payee. So payee is a person who is to receive money on any bill of exchange. And this payee can be the drawer himself also, if the drawer orders that the money shall be paid to me, or it may be a third person about whom the drawer mentions in that bill of exchange. So these are the three parties involved. Another specimen you can see about a bill of exchange. So bills of exchange look like this. So in a bill of exchange, there's a stamp, which is a legal stamp, the revenue stamp, which has to be uh, affixed here. So for any kind of money instruments, stamping is required. So the stamp has to be there. It can be on the top, it can be at the bottom. Then in any bill of exchange, there will be an order by the drawer to the drawee. So in that case, that order will be written in these words. There are no specific legal words, but more or less it looks like this. So he'll be mentioning 3 months after date. So he's specifying you the time period. 3 months after date, pay Mr. R or his order a sum of rupees 1,50,000, value receipt. Now in this case, this is time of the bill, 3 months after date. Then you are ordering that the payment shall be made to Mr. R. That means Mr. R is the payee, or his order, either to Mr. R himself or to the person to whom he orders. And how much sum of money has to be paid? Rupees 1,50,000, which will be mentioned in the figures also. Value received word may be written or may not be written, which means there has to be some consideration. Then The person who draws this bill, who is the drawer, he will be putting his signatures here with the place of drawing of that instrument. So Mr. P has signed here and he has mentioned the place, Mumbai, India. Mentioning of place is not mandatory. You may mention or you may not mention. So in this case, this is a place and the place of drawing of the bill and date of the bill is mentioned here, Mumbai, India, and the date of the bill or drawing of the bill is January 15. Now this Mr. P is a drawer and he is making an order. To whom he is making this order? He is making this order to Mrs. Q. So Mrs. Q is the drawee here and Mrs. Q is going to pay money. She is living in Pune, India. So Mrs. Q becomes a drawee. That means, as per the example which I gave you above, Mr. P will be the supplier or the creditor. He is ordering Mrs. Q, who may be the customer or the debtor. She is supposed to make payment after 3 months. Now, Mr. P could have said that payment shall be made to me. So in that case, Mr. P would have become the payee. But Mr. P has mentioned pay Mr. R. So by mentioning pay Mr. R, he has made Mr. R the payee. So after this, the bill of exchange will be drawn and will be given to the Mrs. Q, the drawee. And then drawee has to accept that bill of exchange. So on 18 January, she has accepted it. Now, what are the other implications of this acceptance and so we'll be discussing later on. So let me tell you, drawer is Mr. P in this bill of exchange, drawee is Mrs. Q, and payee is Mr. R. And what kind of instrument it is? As we discussed in the last lecture, we have some other classification of instruments also. This one is an order instrument because you are mentioning to pay to Mr. R or his order. A specified name person is there. It is not pay me. In that case, it would have become a bearer instrument. Then it is a time instrument because there is a time schedule to be paid 3 months after date. In case the time is not mentioned, then it becomes a demand instrument. In that case, whenever the bill is presented to Mrs. Q, she will have to make payment. But in this case, there's a time mention. Thirdly, it is an inland instrument because it was drawn by a person in India and payable to a person within India. Payable by the other person within India. Then date of drawing is mentioned here, January 15, and date of acceptance is also mentioned here, January 18. And there's a stamp here, there's a certain fixed amount here, amount in figure and amount in words is the similar. So these are certain aspects of the bill of exchange. Now, considering all this, let me discuss with you the provisions about the bills of exchange. So, under Section 15 of Negotiable Instruments Act, the bill of exchange has been defined like this. A bill of exchange is an instrument in writing. So as we discussed yesterday, the definition of negotiable instrument, it has to be an instrument in writing. Then this instrument will contain an unconditional order. So drawer will be making an order on the drawee and this order has to be unconditional. You cannot impose any conditions. It has to be unconditional order. Then this instrument has to be signed by the maker. The maker here is the drawer. The drawer has to sign it. Without signing, it is not complete instrument as per section 5. Then the order is making a direction to a certain person. Certain person means the drawee himself. You are specifically mentioning that this is a drawee on whom I am making this order. Then order is to pay a certain sum of money. The money cannot be any amount which will be due by you towards me. You have to specifically mention a specified amount. Then this amount is payable only to or to the order of a certain person. So like in my example, it was payable to R or to the order of R. Or this instrument could also have been to the bearer of the instrument. In case you do not make mention about any person's name as pay, then it becomes a bearer instrument. So in case there's a name, it becomes order instrument. If it is without name of the payee or the recipient, it becomes a bearer instrument. So depending upon this definition, the bill of exchange will have three parties: drawer, drawee, and payee. So certain things you have to keep in mind regarding these parties. In a bill of exchange, the drawer and the payee can be same person. Like in this example which I gave to you, Mr. P could have been the payee himself. Then he would have written pay to me. So in that case, he will be the payee also and he was the drawer also. Then the drawer and the drawee may also be the same person. Like in case a head office is writing a bill of exchange on the branch or vice versa. So legally head office and branch are same entity. In that case, it can be drawer and drawee may be the same. I hope you have heard about head office and branch in your branch accounting chapter in financial accounting. Thirdly, drawee and payee may also be the same person. And drawee is a person who has been directed to make the payment on the due date. And drawee was to make this payment to payee. Now, it can so happen that this payee has not kept the bill of exchange with himself till the due date. He transferred this instrument to somebody else. And as I discussed with you yesterday, we can have multiple times transfer of an instrument from one person to the other person to the other person, which is called endorsement. So in that case, when these instruments are transferred, it may be possible that because of multiple transfers, ultimately the bill comes into the hands of the drawee himself. Now, drawee becomes the endorsee or the recipient of the instrument. That way, he will receive the money on that instrument, and he, being a drawee, was also supposed to make the payment also. So, in such exceptional circumstances, the drawee and payee may also be the same person. We shall be discussing more about this in the upcoming topic of endorsement. Now, what are the essentials of any valid bill of exchange as per the Act? First of all, it has to be in writing. Then, it must have an express order to pay. The words mentioned can be different, but it must convey the information that it is making an express order to pay. You cannot make any request. You cannot mention you owe me this money. You have to expressly mention an order. The language should be such that it appears that you are directing a person to make you the payment. Thirdly, this order has to be unconditional. Fourthly, the order has to pay money on the amount only in money. You cannot make payment in kind, etc. It has to be in money only. And the money payable, the sum amount which is due, must be a certain money, must be clearly mentioned specific money. Then the parties must be certain. Who's the drawer, who's the drawee, who's the payee must be clearly specified. There must not be any ambiguity regarding the same. Then drawer has to sign. Signing is a must. Then intention to make a bill of exchange must be visible. And then you have to deliver that bill of exchange to the drawee for acceptance. There are some more formalities also, like we have seen in that specimen there has to be some date, some place, etc. But these are not mandatory. Even if date is not mentioned or place is not mentioned, it will not invalidate the bill, but it must be there because that helps you to uh, follow your suit in court later on in convenience, with convenience. Then stamp is a must. It must be properly stamped. Properly stamped means the stamp to be imposed depends upon the amount of that instrument, so it should be a proper amount of stamp also. Then bill of exchange may be payable on demand, means it can be a demand instrument, or it can be payable after a definite time. That means it can be a time instrument also. In my example, it was a time instrument, 3 months after date. Then it cannot be made payable to bearer on demand. So bill of exchange can be a bearer instrument or it can be a demand instrument, but it cannot be a combination of these two as per section 1331 of RBI Act. So you cannot draw any bill of exchange which is payable to bearer also and payable on demand as well. Then the bill of exchange being an order. It is binding on the drawee that he is supposed to make payment, but he is bound to make this payment only if he accepts it. So this was all about the bill of exchange. Now returning back to the some other aspects which I want to show before we move on with the next topic for its provisions. I want to discuss with you the term of endorsement here. So yesterday we have discussed that negotiable instruments can be classified into bearer instrument and order instrument also. So an instrument which is bearer instrument, that means it can be transferable by mere delivery. Just like any currency note can be handed over to anybody else, and whosoever holds that currency note, the currency note belongs to him. You need not mention the name of that person on that instrument, that currency note. Similarly, the bearer negotiable instruments also can be transferred just by mere delivery. But in case those instruments are order instruments, then also you can transfer it because it is negotiable instrument. It has to be freely transferable. But in this case, the transferability can be done by endorsement and by delivery. Like see this example, 3 months after date, pay to Mr. Beta a sum of rupees 1 lakh. Mr. Alpha is signing, he is a drawer. Mr. Gamma is the drawee and Mr. Beta is the pay. So how endorsement has to be done? Now this instrument was given to drawee for acceptance. Drawee accepted it, and after acceptance he will hand it over to Mr. Alpha. Mr. Alpha will give it to the pay who is Mr. Beta. Now Mr. Beta has this instrument with him. On the due date, Mr. Beta will be recovering this amount from Mr. Gamma. But Mr. Beta need not retain that instrument with him for the 3 months period. He may transfer this instrument to anybody else to whom he has to make any payment. So in that case, when Mr. Beta wants to transfer this to somebody else, and in case the word Mr. Beta or order is mentioned here, then Mr. Beta can transfer it only by endorsement and delivery. And for endorsement and delivery, on the back of the instrument, he has to do this. What he has to do? On the backside of instrument, this person, let me make some changes here. Mr. Beta wants to endorse it, transfer it to somebody, and that somebody is theta. And in this case, to transfer it to theta, he has to make endorsement. Beta can endorse it to anybody. He endorsed it to theta. So he has to put his signatures of the endorser, who's the payee initially. Then Beta will endorse to theta and he has to write the name of Mr. Theta here. So this has to be done on the back side of this instrument. So by doing this, he can make the transfer to Mr. Theta. So now he can hand it over to theta because his name has been mentioned on the back, and Beta has signed it also to authenticate that I am endorsing this instrument. So this is how the instruments are endorsed. But more details about this we'll do in the next chapter of endorsement. So this much was required to be told because we have to understand these terms coming up in the present chapter also. Now let me show you promissory note also. Now promissory note, in case of promissory note, we have basically two parties, a maker or a drawer and a drawee or the payee. So a person who draws this promissory note, he draws in on the other person. In case of promissory note, the person who writes the instrument, he promises to the other person that I promise you to pay this much money to you on this due date. So in this case, the person who is the debtor, he is the one who draws the instrument. And the person who is the creditor, who has to receive the money, it is drawn on that person. So basically the two parties are maker, who is the debtor, who is the payer, and it is drawn on the creditor, who is the payee. So basically the two parties are supplier and the customer. Customer will draw making a promise to the supplier that I shall pay you this money because you have supplied these goods and services to me. So I am not in a position to give you money right now. So I will be giving you a promissory note. So in that case, we have these two parties. So that way, two parties are maker and a payee. So payee is a person who has to receive money. Maker is a person who has to pay this money. So see this specimen of promissory note. Amount is mentioned here, place is mentioned here, date of instrument is mentioned here, and the words mentioned are 3 months after date, we promise to pay. We promise to pay. Now it is not an order, it is a promise to pay Gulab Singh or order this much money. Stamp is there. Signing person is Rajiv Verma, means maker is Rajiv Verma. He has to make payment and he has to make payment to this payee, Gulab Singh. So name of Gulab Singh is mentioned here. So payee and drawee are the same person. So basically in promissory note, we use the word maker and payee only. There's no drawee as such. Now coming back to the legal provisions regarding promissory note. So promissory note has been defined under section 4. It is an instrument in writing again containing an unconditional undertaking. Undertaking is a promise. So bill of exchange was an unconditional order. This one is the unconditional undertaking. Then again it has to be signed by the maker to pay a certain sum of money only to or to the order of a certain person or to the bearer of the instrument. These words are just the same. So in this case, the two parties are maker and payee. Now, the essentials of promissory note are also quite similar. Must be in writing. The promise to pay must be an express promise. The promise to pay must be unconditional. You cannot put any condition for payment. Must be signed by the maker, and sign can also be thumb mark if the person is illiterate. It will be similar in bill of exchange also. The maker must be a certain person. The payee must be a certain person. The promise to pay must be a certain sum of money. Then it cannot be made payable to bearer on demand. On demand is missed here as per RBI Act. A currency note or a bank note cannot be a promissory note. If you have seen a promissory note, even a currency note, even on the currency note it is mentioned, I promise to pay to the bearer this much money. Just look into the currency note. So the language is similar in case of currency note, like a promissory note is written. But it is not a promissory note because money itself cannot be promissory note. The promissory note is a medium of money exchange, it's not money itself. Then promissory note may be payable on demand, means it can be a demand instrument, or it can be payable after a definite period of time, means it can also be a time instrument. Then it has to be stamped just like the bill of exchange. Other formalities, you can have a number of promissory note, you can have date mention, place mention, attestation may be there, for value received word may be there, but these are not mandatory. But it is good, desirable that you mention all these. So these are the details about the definition, parties, and the essentials of these two instruments. Thank you.